Thank you, and good afternoon. You know, just after I wrote that first column asking what admittedly was a loaded question, where are the black people in downtown Detroit? I did an interview on an urban radio station, and the host asked me on air, he said, well, Nolan, this column surprised a lot of people, and I said, why? And he said, well, a lot of folks think you're a racist. And then he asked me, he said, are you a racist? Well, that's an unsettling question to be asked on a live broadcast. It's sort of my Scott Walker moment, and I'm pretty sure even people who wear sheets on the weekends wouldn't answer yes, but it's been fairly typical of the response I've received over these past 2 months as I've been raising questions about downtown's demographics and what seems to me to be a lack of African American participation. A lot of people are suspicious about why a white, old, conservative columnist even cares about this issue. Others are angry that I'm piddling on the parade of downtown's terrific comeback. A number of black readers have said, we're here, you just don't see us. I can't tell you how many offers I've had to have a drink at Flood's. The reaction has been multi-layered and intense. Nothing I've written over 15 years of writing columns for the Detroit News has generated this intensity of response. I suspect it reflects that a lot of people have noticed the same thing I've noticed about downtown and its makeup. And like me, they're not sure why this situation has developed, or they're uncomfortable confronting it, or they're resentful that we even have to, or they're just bone weary of talking about Detroit's stubborn racial divide. And believe me, I tend to fall in that last category. This is not a hornet's nest I wanted to kick, lest someone drag me into another room for yet another conversation about race. But I wrote that first column because for 2 years, I've been puzzling over the absence of blacks in the hot and hip new downtown night spots. I've come to expect now that wherever I go, everyone will be younger than me. What I don't expect in a city that is 83% black is to be in a crowded Detroit establishment and having nearly everyone be as white as me. I drink a little, so I get out a lot and to a lot of different places. It occurred to me that I was seeing far more diversity in the suburban night spots than I was in the cool new downtown Detroit spaces. Downtown Birmingham is more diverse on most nights than downtown Detroit. So I started talking to people about why this is, and I got mostly shrugs in response. Everybody seemed to notice it. Nobody really had a clue as to the why. During the holidays, I attended a number of civic and cultural holiday parties, business parties, and even in those gatherings, I noticed the same thing, mostly white crowds sprinkled with a few black faces. Watched a program last fall on Detroit Public Television about this, all the cool new things to do in downtown Detroit and all the new efforts being made to revive the city. And again, almost everyone interviewed for the program, whether it was from a business or a nonprofit or whatever, nearly everyone was white. A website affiliated with the New York Times came to Detroit to do a blog about all the fabulous artwork coming out of the city. And all of the artists mentioned were white. But I finally decided to write about this after being asked to greet a group of future Detroit leaders, say a few words to them. And this group of 50 future Detroit leaders included just one African American. With the country simmering and the racial resentment stemming from Ferguson and New York City, my concern is that we're creating conditions in Detroit that could easily lead us to the same place. And that's not somewhere Detroit, with its long, contentious racial history, needs to go. Everyone was working too hard, investing too much money and energy into the long-awaited comeback to have it derailed by hostility over the emergence of two Detroits, one white and hopeful in a soaring downtown, the other black and desperate, trapped in neighborhoods that are still struggling. As I said, I heard from a lot of people after that first column, including Eric Williams from Wayne State University, who will join us on the panel in a few minutes. Eric's theory, which he'll expand on, is that opportunity and cultural gaps work against African American entrepreneurs, presenting them with obstacles not faced by their white counterparts. Also spoke with a young executive, Marie Alexander, a native Detroiter who's getting married soon, thinking about starting a family, and is looking for a home in the suburbs. When I asked her why, she said, at some point, you want a less eventful life. She explained that for those who grew up dealing with the hassles and dangers of life here, Detroit doesn't hold the same allure as it does for the newcomers who still view Detroit perhaps as a playground. African American business owners who had stuck with the city through its toughest times complained of not being celebrated in the same way as are these new white startups. I heard a lot of comments about black bottom and corporate conspiracies. The head of a financial services firm called me after the column ran. He said it's almost impossible to build a diverse workforce in Detroit because there are so few African American CPAs to choose from. The new Detroiters told me they were fed up with being made to feel like interlopers, as if they had no right to be here. They saw opportunity and seized it, and that's a good thing. These young creatives need to be celebrated. They've accomplished something with their grassroots rebuilding of Detroit that has defied generations of well-heeled business executives. We need them here. We need them to feel welcome and appreciated for their work, for their fierce love of Detroit, and for their willingness to take risk to aid its comeback. So again, this issue plays out on a lot of levels. What we hope to do today is to look at it from various perspectives and start talking about some positive steps that we might take. And although I do recognize there are some institutional causes at work, I don't believe this has evolved intentionally, but we have to be intentional in our response. We have to be more conscious of inclusion when we put together groups and organizations to support Detroit's comeback. We have to examine whether we have enough African American involvement in development decisions and participating in venture capital efforts. We have to be honest about the role the failed educational system plays in limiting the ability of Detroiters to take the jobs that are being created downtown. And at the same time, we must realize that a diverse downtown starts with a diverse workforce. We have to work harder at recruitment and training. We don't need to play the blame game again, but we do have to share responsibility. Just as we must actively invite more African Americans' participation, we also must challenge the black professionals and business executives who have left Detroit over the years to come back and be part of this new beginning. And we have to be mindful in rebuilding neighborhoods that we aren't pushing out longstanding businesses and residents. Fortunately, there's a lot of room in Detroit. There's a lot of empty space still. We can add a lot more people of every background without shutting the door to anyone. So why does an old white conservative commentator care that you could sit in a restaurant in downtown Detroit and think you're in downtown Minneapolis? Well, for the same reasons you all should. This is about business. As much as anything else, this is about business. Racial tension and resentment are bad for business. Divisiveness is bad for business. The investments being made in Detroit will grow faster and higher in a healthy, harmonious community. Beyond that, aren't we all getting tired of a racial divide that has dominated the conversation in this town for decades and held us back? Isn't it time to close it? Aren't we weary of the self-segregation and misunderstanding? We're building a new Detroit. Let's not build into it the same flaws that helped bring down the old Detroit. As we move into this brighter future, we have to commit to moving there together. Thank you.
Welcome, the President and Chief Executive Officer of Ignition Media Group and President of Archer Corporate Services, Dennis Archer, Jr. President and CEO of Strategic Staffing Solutions, Cindy Pasky. Detroit City Councilman, Andre Spivey. Director of the Program for Entrepreneurship and Business Law at Wayne State University, Eric Williams. And joining Nolan Finley to moderate the discussion, WDIV Channel 4 news anchor, Devin Scillian.
You know, Nolan, just when I thought you were growing a heart, you reminded us that it's just all about business. I get it. Okay. No, this is fascinating, and this has been a topic that Nolan and I have been talking about for a long, long time, and I'm really glad that we got to address it in a formal way. Or should we? Councilman Spivey, there's an interesting, I think, counter to what Nolan is talking about. Even the mayor in his State of the City address said, I don't want to talk about inclusion, I just want to do it. And I guess that there are some that feel like this is just picking at old wounds, old scabs, and that. But what do you think is happening here, and is it deserving of our conversation?
Devin, I was home reading the paper in December, and I read the article from Nolan, and immediately I began typing a response. And I think we're here because of the article, and we see you uniting two Detroits. I think we do have. I know we have one Detroit. We have different ethnicities, different cultures, different people within Detroit, and we need to lift those things, lift them up, and make sure we have one Detroit. We are 2 years away from the 50th anniversary of the 6/7 riots, and as that approaches, we must, as Nolan said, that Detroit is still here in some sense, but it's gone. How do we move forward? And to have dividing issues do not help us moving forward. But today I hope we can solve some issues here and not dwell on what the problems are, but know that we have some panelists here who can move forward with some solutions.
Now, Eric Williams, I heard from you, as I said, after the column ran, and you're the one who told me that you didn't think this was intentional, that this wasn't the product of some conspiracy, but you have some very specific ideas of why we're not seeing more African-American startups in this revival period.
Yeah, I think, well, I guess the first thing I ought to say is, when I say it's not intentional, I do not mean there is a grand conspiracy. I don't want to say that there aren't people out there who act to sort of achieve this result intentionally, but I think part of the problem is that when you're talking about two Detroits, you're talking about two Detroits from a social perspective. You know, you have blacks that end up in one sort of hot locale and whites that end up in another. You have, you know, black businesses that are, but they're different than white businesses. You have investors. In the sense of businesses, one of the problems that you have is that where there are black businesses, they're not the kind of businesses that take off, right? They're not the kind of businesses necessarily where you're going to see the kind of exponential growth that your typical investor is looking for. So out in the, and I hate the phrase neighborhoods because that's like the city, but in parts of the city other than sort of downtown and midtown, yeah, that's not what those aren't the kind of businesses you're seeing. And service businesses and, you know, retail don't get that kind of buzz. And once those kind of businesses, if those businesses aren't getting buzz, if there aren't a lot of those businesses there to begin with because we had so many businesses leave the city, then people growing up in those areas or in areas like those areas don't grow up saying, yes, that's what I should be doing. And that puts you at a real disadvantage.
But when we talked, you talked about the opportunity gaps, the cultural gaps, the fact that the different mindset, as you mentioned, about the different aspirations, but also the networks of support that perhaps these young white entrepreneurs have that their young black counterparts might not have.
Right, and that's a function of culture. It's a function of sort of socioeconomic standing, right? If you start a business and let's say you're starting a restaurant, right? If you know somebody who's an accountant, you know somebody who's a lawyer, you know somebody who can help you, all of a sudden the possibilities for that business to be successful increase exponentially. If you don't know any of those people, if you don't have any idea what sort of hurdles you're going to face, if you don't have somebody who can say, oh, you need to talk to this person, they can help you out. This is somebody who can help you with funding. This is somebody who can help you get your stuff together. Then yeah, I mean, there's just the absence of growing up in an environment where starting your own business is something that you should be doing, and where there are people out there who can provide the kind of support you need. When you grow up without those things, then you're at a disadvantage, and it shows in the split we have in business development here in the city.
Dennis, when we see the kind of night that Nolan described, where if I go to Selden Standard in Midtown, I look around and I see all white people, and then I go to have dinner in Birmingham and I see a more diverse gathering, what am I seeing? What's going on?
I'd say a couple things. First, I want to provide some clarity. You know, while Nolan may be old and conservative, he's not a racist. Some of his best friends are black. I experienced that, and we've talked about it, Nolan and I have talked about it. I think there are a couple of things. I think, and one of the women I think that responded to your piece mentioned this, and you commented on it. A lot of black folks that moved out of the city, who could afford to move out of the city, they moved because there existed then, and still to an extent now, exist conditions that, you know, are not attractive. Crime, some would argue questionable city services, although I will say they're improving. I live in the city. I'm raising 2 sons in the city, young sons in the city. But there are sacrifices, candidly, that I make living in the city. Can't go to the gas station closest to my home. There's not, you know, the number of restaurants in my neighborhood that would exist if I lived in Birmingham or Bloomfield Hills or even Northville or Canton in some of those areas. Yep. People have left the city because they want those amenities close. And those people aren't as enamored to come back downtown. For a lot of people that live in the suburbs, there's a certain panache and excitement about coming down Friday night to dinner. They live in the suburbs, they're safe, they don't have those issues, they come down and they go back home. And that business is needed, and we want more of that to occur. But when you don't see the people at Selden Standard, you know, for the family that left, for the couple that left Detroit because of those circumstances, moved to West Bloomfield, are they coming back down to Detroit on Friday night for dinner when there's a ton of restaurants out there? Yep. And I think that in part contributes to it. I mean, the owners of Selden Standard, who I think we all know, they don't do any advertising. They don't advertise in publications or media outlets that only target white folks. They open their doors, and that's who comes. And nor do I believe they have an obligation to reach out to have a diverse clientele. They want to make money, and money's green. So
in fact, there is a media component to this, because the media has spent a lot of time talking about Selden, has spent less time talking about the new chicken and waffle place that opened at Cuzzo's at Livernois and 7 Mile. So that's a different issue, part of this. But you were getting to, I guess, the heart of the question, which is, what does it cost us? Does it matter?
Well, but the thing about that comparison, there's 2 things. One, Cuzzo's is in the neighborhood. It's on Livernois. Yep. Everyone that's been there, I talked to Katie Cockrell, who works for me. She was ranting and raving about it. So, but it's not necessarily, it's not sexy. It's a chicken and waffle place on Livernois in a neighborhood that's existing by African Americans who are of the neighborhood.
But the portions are a lot bigger than at Selden.
Right, exactly. So, but if you've got...
You don't have to stop and get a pizza on your way home.
On your way home, right. But if you get white entrepreneurs who open up a place in the hood, I mean, because it's the hood. When you walk out of, there's no valet parking. You try to get close because you don't know what's going to happen with your car. That's press-worthy. It's sexy. It's young, white.
Well, that's what happened when when a guy named Phil Cooley opened a barbecue place across the street from the city's biggest eyesore.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I think that the media does have an obligation, I think, to be aware of and report on equally those things, because you actually determine a lot of times what's considered sexy by exposure.
You know, I think we take that responsibility, or that, you know, I think we have played a role in this, in that it's so much more unusual for us, I guess, to see these young white people opening up businesses, you know, in neglected parts of the city, and we have been a little blinded by sort of this light here and not paid enough attention to folks who've been there maybe right next door all along. But I want to ask Cindy Pasky. By the way, Cindy is obviously someone who needs no introduction because they forgot to put her bio in the program. And Cindy, we apologize for that. But you know, I talked to Cindy. I went to Cindy's. It was one of the holiday parties I went to. And it was one of, I told her afterwards, this is one of the few places I've been in Detroit during the holidays that look like Detroit. Extremely diverse. Black and white, old, young. Very good spread, by the way. If you didn't get an invitation, you just missed out. But you work at this, Cindy. And we've talked about the fact that a diverse downtown, diverse restaurants and night spots, it starts with a diverse workforce downtown. You've worked very hard to build one and proved, you know, as we had in today's paper, story about your efforts to create a more diverse workforce. It's not impossible, is it?
No, it's not impossible, and thank you for that. And I mean, I think to Dennis's point, people socialize where they live and where they work. And when we look at Detroit, we really have to look at the whole city, not just the downtown or the midtown. I think anyone who knows me well enough knows that I think downtown is an important neighborhood, but it's just one neighborhood, and it will never be completely successful if the other neighborhoods aren't successful. But each one has its own style, and we want it to have its own style, right? I mean, think of any successful city, large or small, you go to, not just in the United States, but around the world, and there's pockets of flavor and characteristics, and you go here and you go there. But again, people they like to socialize where they live and work. I mean, you know, Dennis is in the media as you are, so he's more politically correct. If I lived in West Bloomfield, I'm not coming downtown because I like to have cocktails, and I'm not driving back home, right? If I walk up to Slows, if I have to, I can walk home. So if you want to find me, you're going to find me in a real small circle. Not that every night I need to walk home. That being said, I don't want to be in your paper for any other reason than I was today.
Me either.
But from a work standpoint, it only happens if you allow it to happen. So if you look at S3, we'll be 25 years old October 1st. 2,700 employees around the world. We've always been headquartered in Detroit by choice. And we have grown every year we've been in business. So we are the absolute proof that if you do not allow 2 Detroits or 3 Detroits or 4 Detroits, if you only allow one group of talented workforce, that you can actually make it happen. Now, do you have to sometimes remove barriers? But you don't remove barriers because someone is a different color or age. You usually remove barriers because they are talented, but they don't have all the skills you need. So you remove the barriers to supplement for those skills, and you end up with an incredibly talented workforce at all levels. You know, one of the things we do every year in our annual meeting, and you've come by and seen the meeting, and so has the councilman, I ask a couple of questions. One is, when you came to work for S3, how many of you came to do a job you've never done before? 65% of the people or 70% of the people raised their hand. Now that you've been with us 3, for those of you who have been with us over a year, how many are doing a job you didn't do when you first came to work for us 3? This year it was 92% of the room. When you can find a way to run a business and do it that way, then you end up with a room that looks like an S3 room. And it can be done because we're still profitable and we grow every year, and everybody knows we're profitable because we give a tremendous amount of money away intentionally every year. So it makes for good business, not bad business, but it has to be, you can't allow anything other than that in your corporation.
Yeah. Dennis, you and I have talked about something I want to let everybody here address a little bit, and that's the culture of entrepreneurship and creating it where it perhaps hasn't existed before. Talk a little about that, and then we'll let everybody else weigh in.
I think, and that's a good point, and kind of parlays to what you were talking about. You know, traditionally, particularly, it may be different around the country, but here in a very blue-collar Midwestern town, African Americans in particular when you grow up, you know, you grow up, you go to school, you get a job, you know, in my parents' generation, you stay at that job until you retire, and then, you know, you maybe get a house up north and a boat. The whole idea of starting your own business and being an entrepreneur is not something that is talked about. It's not even aspired to, because a lot of people are not aware of it. And I'm not here to say that, you know, all of white America sits around their dinner table in the evening talking about debt instruments and investment opportunities, et cetera, but it clearly happens more than it does in the African American community. And to your point about finding talented people, bringing those people in, and then providing them tools to grow, you know, one of my largest clients is General Motors, and I sit on their supplier council, and they have a program where they take promising, smaller, diverse suppliers, and they put on programming throughout the year on access to financing, on becoming more efficient on your warehouse floor, on hiring better, because they realize that better suppliers are better for their business. And a more healthy African-American owned supplier is going to participate more in their community, like Cindy does in this community. Mm-hmm. If she all of a sudden was not doing well, she would not be as philanthropic in the area. So it flows. And so one of the questions or approaches that we need to identify is, how do we take that same approach that S3 does internally, that a lot of Fortune 100 companies do with their suppliers, and apply that to entrepreneurs in Detroit? Mm-hmm. The professor has a program that he's involved in. Roderick Miller, who's now CEO of the DEGC, has a program through Power Moves that he's bringing from New Orleans to Detroit. There are a lot of programs that are going on. A lot of the issue is a lot of aspiring entrepreneurs don't know about them. And that's one of the things that we were talking about in the back, is that how do you get that word out?
Now, Eric, you talked about some of the differences between white entrepreneurs and black entrepreneurs, and you said that the African Americans who come in and are approaching you for help in starting a business tend to be a little older, at a different place in their lives and their careers, and perhaps less risk resilient. How do you help them get a start? What assistance do they need that perhaps a younger startup business wouldn't need?
Well, I think, well, Dennis, you hit on part of it, right? Which part of it is making people aware of the resources that are out there. So, I mean, everything from entrepreneurship programs like those they have at Tech Town, to programs being run out of Prosper Us, running out of Southwest Solutions. So there are a lot of programs out there, and clearly linking people up with sort of general programs is part of it. But the other part of it is recognizing that there are a lot of entrepreneurs, you know, black folks running businesses, and they're just not legit, right? I mean, I have tons of people who've come in who've been in business for, you know, 3, 4, 5, 10 years. But the problem is, because they're operating on a cash basis, they don't have the same kind of, they don't have access to capital, right? They haven't necessarily gone through all the licensing, haven't taken care of all the licensing or permitting that they need to do. They're operating out of a space that probably, you know, isn't meeting all the requirements that need to be met in order for it to be a space they can operate out of. And so helping people address those kind of issues, sort of transition from, you know, sort of the gray market, as it were, gray market economy, to actually being a legit business, I think is going to be a big part of that. Another part is inevitably, how can I say this? Encouraging people, as you said, encouraging people to view entrepreneurship, starting a business, as an option earlier on, right? I mean, it doesn't do any good. It doesn't do any good for you to suddenly go, wow, I have a great idea for a business, and if I didn't have, you know, a wife, kids, mortgage, car note, paying for my insurance, I would be on it right now. No, that just doesn't work, you know, and there's too much of that.
Okay, so both of you have talked about that early exposure to business people and those dinner table conversations. And we recognize that in a city that's lost so much of its small businesses, and how do you replace that? I mean, what do you do to help these young kids junior high, high school, develop sort of that aspiration. Councilman, what could be done?
I agree with Eric that we have some businesses that aren't legit. I agree with that. But we have over 50,000 that are a part of the Michigan Black Chamber of Commerce that partners with the Detroit Regional Chamber. So we have a cadre of businesses there. How can we take those businesses and Dennis Model and GM to support those businesses in our community who know I have a check coming in every month from this major business, and I can go out and find business elsewhere. But we have business in the city of Detroit. They are here and they're viable. And then the early on exposure, Nolan, as whether you're a Jewish child or a Chaldean child or Arab American child, it starts early. And so in my own household, with 2 parents with 5 degrees, we didn't necessarily talk about owning a business early on. Our motto was, go to school, go to college, find a great job, and have a family. But now our conversation has changed. So our children once a week are saying, I want to own this building. I want to own this business. So our conversations changed. The problem is we have children from households who have parents that don't have that mindset. Now, we had 5 degrees, and we didn't have it early on. Those who don't have that mindset, where the child will never hear about owning a business. All they know is, I'm going in a party store, there's plexiglass between me and the owner. I'm going to a gas station for my meal. What hope do I have in this community? So early on, so how can we take African-American businesses, Dennis Archer, he's an entrepreneur, a Roy Roberts, a Rodney O'Neill, a Jim Jenkins, and not even African-American, a Cindy Pasky, for the little girls to see I can't own a business, and go in early on and saying this is how, these are the options that you have, and make it real. So they know when I leave this place, I have an option. I may not be able to be college material, but I know I can open a business. I told a child, Nolan, go down the major thoroughfare in your neighborhood, ask each business owner, can I clean your windows for $10 a week? That's a business. If they start now, when they get older, it may expand to something else. So I think the earlier the exposure, the better exposure would be.
Well, and, I think the mayor's right on to this because, look at what they're doing with the internship program this year. So, Nolan, you and I grew up in different states, but in very similar situations. So, we didn't talk about that stuff at the dinner table, right? No. My mom didn't talk at all. So, come on, it was we talked about if we were going to be able to eat that week.
We mostly fought.
Yeah. So, but if you think about a way to expose young people, which is perhaps different than the individuals that Eric is referencing, the internship program is absolutely magical. Now you see the mayor has gotten all the groups to work together and companies to sign up. So there's a way for young people to get exposed to something that they may not get exposed to at home. Yeah. They may not even get exposed to in our schools yet, but if they're in a good internship program, then that's a whole nother way for them to say, oh, there's this. I had no idea. But to think that every successful entrepreneur grew up with exposure to any of that, I expect if you talk to John James, he would say, heck no. I didn't. It's. So there's always other vehicles. And Eric, I think, if someone has a gray business, that's a really good way to put it, versus legit and legal and paying taxes. If someone has a gray business, even if they cash flow well, no one's going to invest in them. They're not legit. So the first thing you could do to help all of those businesses is say, you got to go figure out how to be legal, or just go work for somebody and then make yourself legal and come back.
Well, actually, what I do is help them get legal. But unfortunately,
my resources you're part of the law department. It's like, my goodness gracious. That is so unacceptable. To say someone can't get a loan because of cash flow, no, they can't get a loan because they've never paid taxes or they don't have financial statements. Well, not because they're a cash business. Banks deal with cash businesses all the time. What do you think S3 is? We run a payroll twice a month. We're the ultimate cash business. We finance our payroll for 90 to 120 days, depending on when our customers pay us.
Well,
for years, Paul and I didn't take a paycheck so we could pay our consultants. But you know what? We were legal. We filed taxes, and we never pretended we weren't anything but that.
Well, see, and this is part of what I'm talking about. So it's not just simply a matter of not paying taxes, right? So the people I'm dealing with pay a lot of taxes. They pay taxes on everything they buy. Right? They're paying the people who come and work for them sometimes, but they're characterizing them, for example, as independent contractors, when truth is they're actually employees, but they don't know exactly what the dividing line is or where that actually, who actually gets to make that decision, right? Or I've had people come to me with ideas, and they're like, oh yeah, I've been doing this for a few years, and I'm thinking, this is illegal. I mean, and they came to me because they wanted, a lot of times it was sort of, oh, you pay to come into a joint, and everybody puts their money in a pot, and then you play some games, and it's kind of it's a nice little, it's illegal. You can't do that. And they come to me because they want to make it legal. It's the candle shop on the corner at Eastern Market. Yeah, they want to make it legal. I mean, they want to pay taxes. They want to pay,
Nobody wants to pay taxes.
Well, no. they want to pay taxes as much as anybody.
I think North Koreans would want to pay taxes.
So those
if they could vote.
But so the problem isn't a desire. The problem is a lack of knowledge and understanding about what sometimes is necessary to get a business open. And one of the problems is, and Detroit has this problem probably more than it really should, is that it's not easy to be legit, right? I mean, if you identify a space and you want to move into it, you want have it put together. Just simply sometimes having the inspector come out, I mean, your cash burn is going, and it's taking you forever to actually get into and build out a building.
And it's the same way in Philadelphia, and it's the same way in New
Orleans.
But
it is probably worse in Detroit.
And it's tenfold in Chicago and Manhattan.
It is not worse than in those places in Detroit. Detroit's trying, but part of the problem is the infrastructure that's behind this is so antiquated that simply the city just can't keep up.
Do you do business in Philly?
Pardon
do you
me?
do business in New Orleans? I do.
Okay.
All right. It's not any easier there than it is here.
How often do you yourself have to go down somewhere and stand in line?
A lot.
Okay. You personally go and stand in line. Well, that's unusual because in most places you can actually go online and do it as opposed to actually having to go downtown.
But those things are changing. So tell me this.
And that's what I'm saying. They're trying to change.
Should it be easy to be an entrepreneur?
There are enough things that are difficult without sort of
without
the city, without the infrastructure that's supposed to be provided by the public functioning. I mean, that's part of what it is. That's like saying, why should it be easy to drive a truck? Well, it's hard to drive a truck, but it would help if we actually had roads that didn't have holes in them.
Can I chime in?
Yeah.
Can I chime in for 1 second? So a couple things, and then I want to mention about the education. I think that Eric's point, I understand both of your points. Your point is that it could be made a lot easier to get things done. Being an entrepreneur is not easy.
Not at all.
And if you want something easy to do, then you should go get a 9-to-5 job. Bingo. And not all 9-to-5 jobs are easy, but I merely say that to say that there are challenges no matter what level of entrepreneur, whether you have a lawn service with 1 truck or whether you have 2,700 people globally. It's not easy. The city, I think, can do a better job. The city's responsibility is to create an environment that is welcoming to residents, businesses, and people that come down here to hang out and play in the city. But that's the responsibility of the city.
But that situation did the same for black entrepreneurs as it is white entrepreneurs.
With the following, this is the exception I think that you were referencing, is that if you have a day job and you're trying to start your business and you've got 1 hour to run downtown to try to get a permit before you got to get back to work, and you're doing it on your lunch, and you get down there and 3 times it happens and you can't even get to the front of the line in the office, you'll be deterred. Your point is, that's just tough luck. That's entrepreneurship. Figure out a way to keep going down there till you get it done. And both points are understanding.
Our whole point is making it easier for black businesses to be a part of the process.
Let's stop
but when you talk
easier.
about challenges...
Let's talk about removing barriers.
We'll say removing barriers. So to remove a barrier is to make it barrier-less to go to City Hall and to make sure that we get through the process.
And it shortens the cost.
No, I see it every day. I see it every day.
Let's talk about in terms of business. Easy is like a frickin' 4-letter word. We want to remove barriers, we want to reduce cost, and we want to shorten the time. That's what we want to do. That's what business people do.
And reduce a barrier is for that great business to know that I can go online, I can get my license and permits, I can do what Mayor Duggan wants to do, match a property owner with a fledgling business and bring them together. Not to make it easy. We all would be business owners if it were easy, but to make the process barrier-less. That's our new word today, Cindy. Barrier-less. for those so that we will have a unified Detroit
Right.
and black businesses have the same opportunities as white businesses.
But what about capital?
We've got
talk
two
about
different
capital?
lanes that are kind of emerging from the conversation. You've got this one that is about business and the way to run business, and you'd have to be in terrible denial to not believe that minorities have had a tougher time finding access to capital over the years and things like that. That's one lane. The other lane that is trying to create the overlap that I think that Nolan's columns suggest that he's seeking, I'm trying to figure out if we ever get there. People tend to self-segregate. I went to a very integrated high school. It was probably 60-40 white to black, but at lunchtime, the tables tended to be, here's the white kids sitting over here, black kids sitting over there. And so I guess that this broader question of Nolan trying to find one Detroit, I guess I'm wondering, do we have to create ways of bringing people together? Is that in our interest? Or do people pretty much get in their own lanes
Devin,
and
in
stay
response
there?
to that, I think going back to Nolan acknowledging what Cindy has done quite intentionally in her workforce, if more of that happens, then Selden, not to pick on them, it's a great restaurant, but how Selden looks will organically change. It'll organically change. There have been too many efforts to try to force people together. It doesn't work. It has to happen organically. So if there
My hunch is that's absolutely right.
If the workforce downtown is more integrated, the restaurants will by default become more integrated because people are going to go to lunch near where they work. And so if there are more black people working downtown in some of these cool hip places where there are to work now, they will populate the restaurants, and that will happen organically. I want to go back 1 second to talk about the education piece, because fixing it right now, you can fix it, but in order to really, put a stopgap, if you will, in the problem, is you got to go back to the kids. And I don't know why we don't have an entrepreneurship curriculum in the Detroit public schools. Because if you did that, if you coupled a curriculum, and I'm not an educator, so I don't know at what grade that makes sense, but if you provided a curriculum that was in the Detroit public schools, and you layered that with the mayor's entrepreneurship program, and then you layer that by entrepreneurs like Cindy saying, hey, if you could go through all of that, people are guaranteed at least an interview at S3. Now all of a sudden, you people have that, if not the spirit of entrepreneurship, they're at least aware of it as an option.
Take DAPSEP, right? Detroit Area Pre-College Engineering Program, right? So that's something that's, it's in the schools, but, they meet outside of school, and it starts very young, and it goes all the way through high school. If you did something like that, or even later an entrepreneurship sort of component on top of that, then one of the things that you're doing is you're reaching out to kids who, have an interest in engineering. That's a great field for somebody to start thinking about starting their own business. So you're reaching out to them, you're touching them, you're not only influencing them, you're influencing, sort of their family, everybody they're in touch with, and suddenly, who knows what might be able to be commercialized out of the things, because I've seen these kids build some really interesting things, they're, 8th, 9th grade, and they're building things, I'm like, that's really cool. You mind if I get the patent on that? Because that's looking kind of nice. And it would be amazing. But part of the problem is up until, the mayor's speech, he made it clear that that's something they're going to prioritize. And prioritize doesn't mean you talk about it more. Prioritize means you put money toward it, right? So it's kind of the first time we're prioritizing that in a minute. Because it's the first time in a minute the city's had the flexibility with its finances to do that. So you're right, seeing something like that, whether it's through DAPSEP or another program, I think would actually be incredible. Even if it's through Boy Scouts or Webelos, I don't care.
Before we get to audience questions in a few minutes here, I want to go back to capital and access to capital. The day I wrote that first column, story in the business section about a new venture capital fund forming to aid Detroit startups. All 4 principals were white. Do we have enough African-American participation in the investment community?
Well, the short answer is no. I mean, it's just...
And how does that play out here?
I mean, I just think it's a career path. I think that if you go back to what we talked about earlier, in terms of how people are brought up and the careers they choose to follow, investment, it's no different on Wall Street. It's not a Detroit issue. If you go to Silicon Valley, we're not well represented. By we, I mean just people of color, period, and women are underrepresented. If you go to Wall Street, we're underrepresented. And certainly in a traditionally blue-collar town, where people are, 90% of the people, if not more, have some relation to the automobile industry. The investment space is not a space where we're well represented. That doesn't mean that those 4 white folks cannot make a concerted effort to include black people or people of color, because we know we have proof on the stage of people that have gone out of their way to do that. But some people aren't incentivized, or it's not in their heart, and so they don't do it.
Dennis, the short answer is no, and I will never tell folk how to spend their money. But I think there are enough African Americans in Detroit who could pull the resources together to become, maybe not traditional sense, an investment fund or firm to help start or push some of these businesses forward. We have the people here. We have enough automobile executives, former athletes, business owners, but who will bring them together? And oftentimes, there's a cultural divide. We bring people together. Who's going to be in charge? Who's going to run? Who's going to watch the money? And get those things beside us and say, we need to do this, not just for our community, but for greater Detroit as well.
A bigger issue is what's exposed. I mean, Detroit as a city has the highest percentage of African-American owned businesses of any of the large cities in the country. The state of Michigan has 72,000 black-owned businesses. You can go down a list of very successful black entrepreneurs. We have African-American entrepreneurs with Detroit-based businesses with billion-dollar revenues and are among the largest African-American owned companies in the country. They're just not in these cool spaces. I mean, a guy can open up a restaurant in Courttown with $1 million in gross receipts, but the guy down the street on Clark with $2 billion of gross receipts, who's African-American, gets less press. And so it's not that it's not here, it's just a lot of what we all find very exciting are tech startups, app developers, coders, somebody who owns a cool bar or restaurant downtown in a gritty neighborhood. That's just to get what gets the attention. So let us not be fooled, and let the message not be that there are not successful African-American entrepreneurs or minority entrepreneurs in Detroit, because for every African-American entrepreneur, you can talk about Hispanic and other entrepreneurs. We got Frank Venegas, who does a great job and has a great company. It's just the exposure is not there a lot of times.
I would say, to a large degree, to a large degree, I agree with you. But part of it is that those hot areas, like like tech and all that, it's not that there aren't black entrepreneurs who are in that space. But one of the problems that you have is when you have a homogeneous investment pool, investor pool. Just like if you have a homogeneous anything else, people tend to invest money unless they're making a conscious effort otherwise. People tend to invest money and support people that look like them, right? So until you diversify the group of people who we have acting as angels and the like, until you include more women, until you include more Latinos, until you include more black folks, you're gonna see fewer women, Latino, and black folks-led businesses do that.
How do we do that?
Well, part of it is letting people understand what it takes, for example, to be an accredited investor, so that they know, hey, this is something that I can go and do, right? There's a number of programs. In fact, give some props to the Pipeline Fellowship, which is a program that actually, is focused on getting women who are accredited investors, teaching them how to do due diligence, how to get out there and be involved, and how to identify businesses that, it makes sense for them to invest in. You need to explain to people who have the resources, right, to be angels, that this is a way you do it. You don't take your money if you have it. If you have the extra money to spare, you don't just necessarily go put it in a CD. The other thing is making it possible for people, and Dennis is to this, to invest in smaller amounts, right? People who aren't necessarily accredited investors. And it's a wonderful tool, for example, if you're going to start thinking about using it as a way to have people have a stake in community development, right? So, I mean, there are ways to address it, but you have to recognize that it's an issue, and your article actually did that. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about a restaurant or whether you're talking about the investor pool. If you look around and everybody looks the same in a place where everybody shouldn't look the same, there's a problem.
That's right.
Right? There's a problem, and it's uncomfortable to talk about it, but I give us credit for at least having the conversation, because until you have the conversation, you just have a lot of people fuming and other people clueless.
Yeah.
Questions?
Yeah, tell you what, we're going to open it up to, we wanted to allow a little bit of time for any comments or questions from the audience. We got our folks with the microphones, we've got one posted over here. We've got one on each side. So if anybody's got anything that they'd like to add or feel like we haven't addressed, please feel free to put your hand up. And we've got about 10 minutes here so that we can, nothing yet?
I think he said there are cards on the table.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear.
Well, there were cards on the table.
Oh, you've got cards on the table, exactly right.
We didn't get
for
them
that
up here.
too.
Do we have one here? Kathy? Okay. Well, then let's just keep talking about this. One of the things you mentioned, Dennis, at the start was you had a out-migration of the black middle class and black professionals to the suburbs, and you know, as Cindy said, they don't want to get drunk and drive all the way from downtown to Birmingham.
I didn't say
I don't
drunk.
think she said drunk.
I didn't say drunk.
She said herself. She said herself. You didn't want to walk.
I read between the lines. And, you know, so how do we get these
Your
folks?
social habits are on way too much display here today.
How do we get those folks who they have their roots here? Maybe they grew up here, they lived here for a long time, and they've left. How do we get those folks with roots here, who have their roots here, to follow that same sort of path back into Detroit that their white counterparts who left earlier are having? How do we get them to come back, not only socialize here, but invest here, do their business here? How does that?
I mean, I think if you look at, you know, sort of a bell curve, and you've got the early adopters and the innovators, and then you come all the way down, you've got the latecomers. I think, you know, unfortunately, a lot of those people are going to wait until it goes up and it's coming back down, and finally there's going to be so much going on down here that people are, this is where the hub of activity is going to be. I spent an hour or so today with Ken Narva from Streetworks getting an overview of everything that's going to happen in the 300 acres around the new hockey arena. And when that is finished, which is probably 10 years out, people are not going to have a choice but to come downtown, because between what's happening there and what's happening in the surrounding Midtown, Corktown, and greater downtown area, people are not going to want to go as much to Birmingham or to Troy or other places to dinner. And it's not that I think that we're not trying to get people to not go to those places. It's about options. You live in other towns and you got a bunch of options. And so I may want to stay close to home one night. I may want to get an Uber, you know, and go downtown another night. And so,
well, the real test of what's happening in Detroit will eventually come when we somehow find a way to stop the exodus, right? I mean, when the young people who are going in right now and getting all excited about being in the city, are they going to get fed up with car insurance rates that are too high, with taxes that are too high, with services that are not up to par? And when they have children, it's time to send them to school, do they do what the generation before them did? I mean, that's the real test of what we're doing, isn't it?
But to drive that change, then we have to remember that when we talk about Detroit, we're not talking about 7.2 miles. We're talking about all the neighborhoods in Detroit. So if you want people to come back and invest in the city of Detroit, they have to be able to find a home on a neighborhood where the street light is on, where the police officer drives by, where the garbage is picked up, where their neighbors are good neighbors.
and they can use the local public school.
And they can use the local public school. And then, I mean, for Detroit to come back, it can't just be a discussion about 7.2 miles. And I think, I think if you listen to what the mayor's doing, I think, you know, what does he track now? What is he transparent about? He's transparent about crime stats. He's transparent about streetlights and where they are. Is the garbage picked on time? Is bulk pickup on time? I mean, everything that has an immediate impact on the quality of life, you can now go out every single day. I'm a Facebook friend with the Detroit Police Department. Every single day I see the crime stats for that day. That's how you get people to reinvest. The 7.2, it gets us, in many instances, some good exposure and more interest outside of the state, which is important. It gives us some horsepower in some instances, like the biz. changes in the biz law that could be used in any area in the city of Detroit. We drove it out of the Downtown Detroit Partnership, but we drove it in such a way and had it written such a way that every neighborhood could use that. The councilman knows that. We had a 9-0 vote when we brought it to City Council. The Lighthouse program is now being implemented in the 7 Mile area by the chief of police. So the 7.2, our little area, and I call it ours because that's also where I live, that happens to be my neighborhood. If we're really good at what we do, we drive things and we make tools and ordinances and ideas that every other 7.2 mile neighborhood can implement. But if we don't, we don't go anywhere.
We got a question right here.
Really great conversation, and I appreciate the fact that the chamber has given this time, dedicated time to it. And we've touched on really 2 great areas. One is kind of more the customer side of the equation and what's happening in downtown. And then the other side is the business development side, which are 2 very important conversations that kind of merge together. I guess my observation is, and I live downtown, that yes, it strikes me when I go to a downtown restaurant how most of the audience, the lion's share, are Caucasians. And yet I live downtown and I realize that's really not the case because I live and work, and so I'd say the diversity that we're blessed with in downtown Detroit. And I guess my suggestion would be, it would be very interesting to go to a restaurant operator, or a number of them, and ask them to geocode their customer receipts for a weekend. Find out where people are coming from. And I think what we're going to find is that there's a lot of suburban traffic that are here in Detroit because they've got a great deal of confidence in the fact that they're great establishments, there's a great quality of life, they can feel safe coming to Detroit, and that's something we should really celebrate. But again, my suggestion is to be a little more empirical about where these customers are coming from. And I think we'll learn a lot from that. And again, I think in addition to the challenges we have to have one Detroit, I think we need to celebrate the fact that we've got a wonderful place and people are enjoying it, and they're coming from a really, really large radius, and consequently we're getting a lot of suburban Caucasians that are enjoying our
I think that's on the money. When I'm in Wright & Company, I don't look around at that white crowd and think, oh, look at all these people who live in Midtown or downtown. I think that's on the money. Yeah.
You know, I think, and this is a private club, but I think the Detroit Golf Club is like, right? Right. All right. He can disclose his handicap. I'm not disclosing mine.
It's high.
Yeah, but it is very, very diverse, but it's also in a neighborhood where a lot of the people that live in that neighborhood have chosen to be members of that club.
But I want to go back to something you said just before that when you talked about the 7.2 square miles. And I want to ask the councilman, are we worried at all about gentrification? Is that an issue? Is it a legitimate issue?
It's a legitimate issue, but I think if we're going to be one Detroit, I'm open to multi-ethnicities coming to Detroit. And Cindy said we're not, if you were not from here, you would think all Detroit is Midtown and downtown. So that same energy, Nolan, that we have now experiencing downtown and Midtown, it has to go for the health of our city. Yeah. It has to go in the neighborhoods. It has to.
Are you seeing this sort of inflow from the suburbs reaching the neighborhoods yet?
I do, and I can speak for my own neighborhood. I live in East English Village on the border of Grosse Pointe. So we moved there, one of the reasons, it was very diverse. White, black, retired, working class, you name it, we have it in EV. And so that attracted us to the area. And that goes back to how can we get more African Americans from the suburbs to move back to Detroit? Yeah. Because if we all can't fit in downtown and Midtown. Right. So we have to make sure our 7 districts have crime under control, education under control, street lights, clean streets, parking everywhere, viable businesses while we're here today. If that doesn't happen, though, no one's coming back to the city of Detroit.
What do you hear about gentrification from your constituents?
Well, I'll say this, Nolan, and I'll answer this way if I can. When businesses open in Detroit, if there's a white business, it's as if we see Detroit on the comeback. That's our sign. Detroit is coming back. We have a white mayor, first in 40 years. That's our sign for a comeback. We have white people rollerblading areas that an African American go into. That's our sign for coming back. And not just from Caucasians, but from black people. So we have kind of I don't want to say a low self-esteem, but we have some issues amongst ourselves where we say we're finally coming back because we see white folk coming into Detroit. So there are some who say gentrification is here. Others who say, I don't care who lives in that house. If they pay their taxes, if they are a responsible neighbor, we want them here in the city of Detroit, whether white, black, Latino, Asian, whomever, we want you to come back in our city.
Great
I think
point.
part of that, though.
I'm going to get to another quick question. Also would point out quickly, we're going to have to come up with a working definition of gentrification.
That's right.
Detroit Daily, I would direct everybody to this past week, had a great write-up on that and suggested that while some of us may have our own definitions, demographers and urban planners say that there are two conditions that really would describe gentrification. Number one is property values going up. Number two is the educational quotient of an area going up, the educational achievement. And by those standards, there was more gentrification from 1990 to 2000 in Detroit than there has been 2000 till today. Interesting.
Well,
one more question back
we
there.
aren't in gentrification there.
Yeah, apparently not.
Yeah, my question or combination comment is kind of a reflection on an observation. Not much discussion about the role of immigrants or the sons and daughters or the descendants of immigrants who've helped to stabilize some communities like Southwest Detroit, but they're not the only ones. You have folks from Africa or Arab communities. And what kind of lessons can be learned in terms of them stabilizing certain communities during rather dark periods? Probably we can't discuss all its implications, but what are some of your preliminary thoughts about that? Because for many of us in Southwest Detroit, it's a great place to visit, but that part of the story was never really appreciated.
Well, for Detroit to grow population without draining population for someone else in the region, we need newcomers from outside. This should be the immigration capital of the world. We should open our doors to every immigrant who wants to come to America, bring them right here.
And myself and member Raquel Castaneda-Lopez, we have an immigration task force on the City Council, and the mayor's opening up an immigration office. So we are a welcoming city now, Detroit. So whether you are coming from Birmingham, Michigan, or Birmingham, England, we'd love you to come to Detroit, and we're open to all immigrants coming to our city. That's how we all are here because of immigration.
That's right.
Well, some of us, we came forcefully. We came forcefully. Okay. Thank you, Eric. But we're all here. We're welcome. Yes, sir.
That is going to wrap up not only this session, but also this terrific day. Let's a round of applause to everybody with the chamber who make this possible. Way to go, Sandy, Tammy, your friends. We would invite you all now to head over to the exhibition hall for the reception sponsored by Delta. Thanks for being here, and have a great rest of your day.